Politico is reporting that people on far-right social networks, including Gab, Getter, and Donald Trump's own platform, Truth Social, are boasting about their plans, or have been prior to today, boasting about their plans to work as election poll workers in their precincts today. They talk about installing their own software into elections computers, falsely claiming to be Democrats on their election worker applications in those states where they try to get 50-50 Democrats and Republicans. They publicly detail plans to disregard election rules, including bringing hidden cameras into polling sites. This comes after Michigan Republicans, they write over at Raw's Story, Michigan Republicans were caught on camera telling election observer recruits to bring cell phones and pens to polling places, even though that is explicitly against the law. Multiple election clerks have been accused of breaching voting equipment to try to prove baseless conspiracy theories. Meanwhile, Paul Krugman, writing over at the New York Times, a MAGA America would be ugly. And he more or less starts out at the fourth paragraph. He says, 10 or 20 years ago, now I've been doing, let me just pause for a moment. I've been doing this program for 19 years. It'll be 20 years next March. And I have basically, we started the program in 2003, and I started the program because I believed that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney lying us into the war in Afghanistan, lying us into the war in Iraq, and passing the Patriot Act, and creating the Department of Homeland Security when we'd never, ever in the history of America used the word homeland before. A word that was borrowed from Rudolf Hess and Adolf Hitler, that I believed that these were signs that America was heading toward fascism. I wrote a book about it called We the People. It's a comic book that's no longer in print. You can find used copies on Amazon every now and then. But it was all about that 2003 to 2005 period. I think the book came out in 2005, but it was about that period of time. And why, thank you, Sean. In fact, for those of you watching on television, this is the book, We the People, A Call to Take Back America. And, like I said, it's a comic book, but a multi-hundred page or, a 200-page comic book, but nonetheless. So a lot of us have been saying this for a long time. So back to Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who writes a column for the New York Times. Quote, 10 or 20 years ago, those of us who warned that the Republican Party was becoming increasingly extremist and anti-democracy were often dismissed as alarmists. But the alarmists have been vindicated every step of the way, from the selling of the Iraq war on false pretenses to the January 6th insurrection. He points out, indeed, it's almost conventional wisdom that the Republican Party will, if it can, turn America into something like Viktor Orban's Hungary, a democracy on paper, but an ethno-nationalist, authoritarian one-party state in practice. And then Krugman goes on to say, however, I believe that even this conventional wisdom is wrong. If America descends into one-party rule, it will be much worse, much uglier than what we see in today's Hungary. And I found that absolutely fascinating. He goes through this and he talks about all these plans that Republicans have to basically, destroy our country. America into a debt crisis by refusing to raise the debt ceiling, crash America's credit rating around the world, create an economic depression, just all basically just to punish Joe Biden for being elected president. That's not happening in Hungary. Of course, the equivalent of Republicans in Hungary, Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party, they control the country, so they don't need to be crashing it. And maybe that would happen if the Republicans took over in the United States. But basically, I think what Paul Krugman is arguing here, let me take it out of what I think he is arguing and just tell you what I am arguing, which is that the Republicans, that while Viktor Orban, Hungary is still a member of the European Union. It's still a member of NATO. He's got to walk this delicate line to keep his country stable and safe economically and politically. Yes, he wants to go along with Putin, and yes, he and Erdogan in Turkey, which is also a member of NATO, have been the two votes that have been, very problematic for NATO and Orban's for the European Union in terms of holding Putin accountable for what he's up to. But he just really can't go too far. Whereas here in America, there are no constraints on the Republican Party. And since the Supreme Court has said that right-wing billionaires who don't believe that women should vote, right-wing billionaires who don't believe in democracy, right-wing billionaires who want America to be a neo-fascist state can simply buy elections now. They can pour as much money into elections as they want, and our media has decided that that's not a story. That the $980 million, over $100 million a day over the last week that right-wing billionaires have been pouring into television advertising on behalf of Republican candidates that is tightening up the races is just not a story. It just, you know, these races just tighten up spontaneously, all by themselves. It's magic. It falls out of the sky. But this is the road to hell. This is the road to autocracy. And then you get these right-wingers who are, these right-wing media, who are that, oh, no, we're not doing that. The other side is doing that. Over at thewriting.com, the headline from The Federalist, these are right-wing websites, right? The headline from The Federalist, Dems not going to relinquish power peacefully. They note a political party convinced the country faces an existential crisis if its opponents win at the ballot box is a threat to democracy. Right, so when Democrats say we're in a crisis of democracy, Republicans say Democrats saying that is the threat to democracy. Over at Blue State Conservative, all signs point to a landslide for liberty. Does the nation's socialist left expect to get away with rampant cheating once again, even though there is no longer any rationale for mail-in voting? They ask. PJ Media, Election Day is always a cheat day for Democrats. Town Hall, vote against every Democrat everywhere. Well, that's not unreasonable. If I was on the conservative side, I would be saying that. You know, vote for the love of God, vote is what they're saying. WorldNet Daily, a day of voting and a day of prayer. Okay, not so bad. Does Biden know the fix is in at American Thinker? Clock has run out on Democrats' chaotic closing midterm message. Well, yeah, that's from Fox News. I can't argue with that. So, you know, on it goes. But this, you know, how Jimmy Kimmel became a Democrat hack. All right, so how ugly would a MAGA America be? I started this program today, the first hour, I started talking about how in Portland was Donald Trump's test case. He tried to roll out fascism. He didn't want to do it. You know, I mean, this is ultimately what Trump had in mind for big cities. But Portland's only 1 million people. I mean, you know, in fact, Portland is only, I think it's about 840,000 people. So we're a relatively small big city here. Right? The metro area might be 1.5 million people, something like that, more or less. But Portland is fewer than 1 million people. So perfect place to test out something. And as I told you in the first hour, and I know a lot of people have tuned in since then, the protests had died down here in Portland, the Black Lives Matter protests. There had been some, you know, I suppose you could call them left-wing crazies who were, you know, tagging, spray painting the federal building, and one of them actually tried to set it on fire, which is kind of hard with a brick wall, but nonetheless. But then it died down. You know, I mean, they were being criticized by everybody. And so Trump sends over 700 armed federal officers from a half a dozen different law enforcement agencies. They all take off their ID. They take off their badges, their name badges, and their agency affiliation patches. They're wearing camo, and they're driving around the city, in SUV or in vans, and kidnapping people off the streets and taking them and putting bags over their heads and taking them to the federal courthouse and interrogating them and holding them and then releasing them with no paperwork, no record, except that they've got, you know, they've cloned the guy's phone and they've got all their data and they've got, you know, and this was, and, you know, had this been a year later, I don't think those people ever would have been let out. Right? The question that I think Trump was trying to answer is, can we go into a major city where there are protests against our policies and disappear a couple of dozen people in 30 minutes? Can we do that? And they did. They did it right here in Portland. They shot a protester in the face. He still has brain damage. They shot him with a tear gas canister in the face because he stood up and held up a speaker, a music speaker. His name was Donovan somebody or other. I forget his last name. Young guy. He's got serious brain damage now as a result of this. But this was their test run. Trump is looking at, if he becomes president again, and frankly, I think DeSantis would do the same thing. He's doing it in Florida right now with his election police, creating a fascist state, a state where if you protest, if you stand up, if you simply try to vote, you can go to prison for years. You know, fascist states, you say fascist states and people think, Nazis goose-stepping down the streets. No, that's not what it looks like. That's Nazism. The fascist state that Trump has in mind is more like Pinochet's Chile, where tens of thousands of people were arrested and thousands of them were murdered, but nobody knew. They call them the disappeared. They just vanished. This is what Spain was like up until 1974. Spain went fascist before World War II and literally stayed that way until the 70s. And people were disappearing. I mean, they're just coming to a reconciliation with this in Spain now over the last couple of years. I was in Spain 4 or 5 years ago, maybe a little longer than that. Louise and I went to visit Mondragon for the book I was writing, Threshold. And I mean, they're literally just, at that time, they were literally just beginning to talk about the disappeared in Spain. This is my concern for my country. So please get out there and vote. We'll be right back.